Okay, all right. Well, hello everyone. It's Professor again, and in this video we're going to go ahead and do a quick recap of the previous readings from A Daughter Fortune. So these were the chapters corresponding to there's pages. There's 119 to 169 roughly in the time frame. I might be off a page or two, but these were the chapters of 8 through 10, and these are the chapters. And of course, as you all know by now, Allende doesn't list the chapter numbers, but she gives the chapter title. So again, these are the chapters which correspond to the chapters entitled "The News," "The Farewell," and "Fourth Son." And these are some very pivotal events because these correspond perfectly with the readings that we also had in the Rawls and Bean text. So from the Rawls and Bean text, these were chapters of 7 and 8, and we're looking at the time frame in which the events are happening in California. That is the start of the gold rush. So events from 1848 into early 1849. That's the focus of what's happening in the Daughter Fortune book. And as I mentioned, these events also dovetail with what's happening in the Rawls and Bean text. So, like I did with the last review video, I'll go ahead and quickly recap some of the events and topics and themes in the Daughter Fortune first, and then I'll quickly backtrack and talk about some of the events that are happening in the Rawls and Bean text. Okay, before I get to that, just one quick housekeeping or bookkeeping item that I need to mention. I know that we're now that we're coming up on about halfway done with the Daughter of Fortune readings, and all of you are doing the so far seen some really good jobs, great commentary in the forum. So definitely keep it up, everybody. We're about a third of the way done with that, so we'll just keep going there until about the second week of April. And of course, the big thing coming up in the second week of April is your character videos. So I need to give you a video in terms of how to do that. I actually have two videos for you about that. I've got a character video that I made for the History 108 class last semester, so I'll have that for you coming up next week. And I'll also make a how-to video on how to actually make your video using Blackboard. So Blackboard is linked to Google. So if you have a Google account, then you're good to go. You record the video within Blackboard itself, and then the video is stored. It's stored into your Google/YouTube account. So, but again, I'll have a separate video to talk about all of that stuff. So I'll have that with you coming up into next week. Okay, let's go ahead now and get on with the talking about what's happening in the Daughter Fortune stuff, and then I'll finish off the video talking about events happening in California. Yeah, and kind of ironic. You might have noticed, of course, those who are sports fans. It's definitely a Red Wings jacket here, and you might have noticed the mug here. When I was in New York last month for the AHA conference with my colleague Dr. Contreras, um, I did a little bit of a souvenir shopping in New York at the Newark airport too. So I got this NYPD mug. It's actually my mother's mug, uh, uh, but sometimes she has her stuff here. So and the mug just happened to be here. But I do have a Hard Rock Cafe. Here it is, a Sacramento shirt. So this kind of keeps with the California Gold Rush theme too. So one out of three items definitely corresponds with what's happening in the class. Okay, enough about all of that extraneous extra stuff. Let me go ahead now and get on and talk a little bit about the story itself. And let me just get my iPad queued up. Okay, all right. So chapter 8. Now, chapter 8 begins the second part of the story because Allende has the book split up into three large portions, large chapters. So chapters 1 through 7 cover the first part, and the chapter 8 begins part 2, and these are the events focusing in 1848, 1849. And in the chapter entitled the News, and so I can get a better look at the information on the screen here on my iPad. Let me go and take off my glasses for this part of the video. Um, This is happening in September of 1848. So remember, everybody, since this is the southern hemisphere, so September of 1840, September is a start of spring for Latin America, where of course here in the northern hemisphere it's the start of fall. So by September 1848, Eliza and Joaquin were lovers for about 3 months. So you might say that spring fever was in the air, that type of thing. Uh, but news the news reached Valparaiso about a month earlier, and that, of course, was the news of gold. And in this chapter, Allende really gives a pretty good description about the history in terms of the main movers and shakers, like James Marshall and Sam Brannan, who, of course, were mentioned prominently in the Rawls and Bean text. And Allende talks about how the Chilean people, in essence, have souls of minor too, because keep in mind, Chile was also interested to becoming a a garrison colony, which I talked about in some of the earlier videos. Chile was also a mining colony, and of course, into modern times, into the 20th century, things such as copper. These were uh, these were some very uh, important important mining enterprises. Uh, and since the Spaniards were, of course, interested in looking for any kind of mineral wealth, whether it was gold, silver, whether it was left of the Aztec Empire or the Inca Empire, you might say the Spaniards really introduced a lot of mining skills to native populations. So people in Mexico, people in Chile, people in Peru, Bolivia, those places picked up a lot of mining skills from the Spaniards. So in essence, many of the Chileans already had mining skills, and when they went to California in 1849, they took those skills with them. Just like people of Mexico, especially from the north, from the states of Zacatecas, San Luis Potosí, Sonora, and those areas. So by the end of 1848, people are getting excited about gold. News is traveling not just in the U.S., but all over the world, into Europe, into Asia. Long before the days of the internet and even the telephone and the telegraph was just barely getting going at this point in time. Still, with clipper ships and some of the early steamships, news at that time was traveling quite rapidly in the latter parts of 1840 and into the early parts of 1849. But interestingly, we get to see early on that one of the characters, Paulina del Valle, who of course now at this point in time is married to Feliciano Rodriguez. Paulina doesn't want anything to do with gold. She says that gold is a yellow crap in a very colorful terminology. Of course, you could probably use some other terminology, but I think crap might be, for the most part, I guess, the safest term you can use because in a family setting, so to speak. But whereas Paulina's husband and brother-in-law, much like everybody, much like everybody in the area believes. Okay, let's go get as much gold as possible. Let's join the rush. Blah blah blah. Paulina is definitely more far-sighted, and she recognizes that you don't make the money from from the gold. You make the money from the miners. This is something that Sam Brannan understood. So in essence, Paulina del Valle, she's like the Chilean. She's like the female counterpart of Sam Brannan as the story unfolds. As for Joaquin, at this point in time, Joaquin. He doesn't like the situation. We got a sense of his social situation earlier on in the story. So for Joaquin, it seems that getting out of poverty, the way to get out of poverty was to go to California. So he embezzles the funds from the shipping company, and when it's discovered that he had been taking funds, he's long gone. He's gone to California, and when news of when news of Joaquin's departure hits Eliza, obviously she's definitely heartbroken, and to make matters more complicated, it's apparent that she's pregnant. Mama Frezia tries to get her mentor, the Machi, to help out. But it looks like things aren't working out quite well. Meanwhile, John Summers is in Valparaiso in February 1849, and he brings him another one. We get the first meeting of the Central Asian, the Central Chinese. This is the gentleman Dao Jian. I'll talk a little bit more about Dao Jian in just a moment here. But John Summers is embarking is embarking to go to California, and at this point in time, Eliza is definitely interested in trying to in wanting to go to California to try to follow her lover. Chapter 9 in the farewell, we pick up a little bit more with John Summers in that John is now captain of one of the ships owned by the Rodriguez brothers. And John, as we saw early on in the story, he was definitely an ocean man, a mariner. Some of you addressed the question already. I forget which group had the question. I think it might have been group one. Yeah, I think it was group one. You guys had the question about John, that he falls in love with every port he goes to, but by being at sea for weeks and months, and this kind of cures him of the love sickness, so to speak. So we get a little bit more of a sense of John's character in chapter 9, and. And here, Paulina also demonstrates how she recognizes that people in San Francisco, California, they want culture, they want literature, they want art, they want music, they want fine foods, things of this nature. So, in addition to equipment needed for the mining operations, we find out that in chapter 9 that Paulina, with one of the ships headed for San Francisco, um, one of the ships also takes produce, wine, and even musical instruments. At this point in the story, everyone wonders what happens to Jacob. What happens to Jacob Todd? Because Jacob Todd, like with Joaquin, with respect to embezzling funds, Jacob ran into some problems in a couple of chapters earlier, and we find out that Jacob is involved in a utopian colony. And even this might seem kind of a silly, kind of a crazy thing to do, keep in mind, everybody, in the middle parts of the 19th century, a lot of people were believed in these types of notions, whether it's utopian colonies, ideas of a second coming. That is, in the middle parts of the 19th century, there are many Americans, and I think many Europeans too, who had this notion that maybe life was modernizing too quickly for them. They were afraid of their souls. They were afraid that maybe people were getting away from God, from Jesus, that type of thing. So you get the growth of a lot of these communions, or these alternative religions, for lack of a better term, and early utopian culture. In fact, it's in the early parts of the 19th century where religions such as the Seventh-day Adventists, and of course the Mormon Church, with Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, all of those people, these come into the forefront in the earlier parts of the 19th century. So, in other words, new ways of thinking, new types of religious ideas, and communal arrangements, these are really becoming quite apparent in the 19th century. And Jacob, in essence, is part and parcel of this, part of this process. And in the meantime, Eliza wants to stow away. She wants to try to go to California to try to track down her lover Joaquin, and here we see Dow offering to help out as well. At the end of chapter 9, Allende makes an interesting observation that Eliza had crossed the line of decency. Really interesting comment that Allende makes there, and I think it's in group 3. I'm pretty certain that there was a question there about that. So group 3, that's something that definitely, if you haven't addressed already, you'll definitely get to very soon. Eliza bids goodbye to Mama Frezia, who was helping her to stow away and get her from the Summers family, and Mama Frezia departs with her people to the south. So interesting point in that the Summers family never knew Mama Frezia's last name. So when it became apparent that both Eliza and Mama Frezia were gone, the Summers didn't know how to track Mama Frezia because they didn't know the family name. That was actually a fairly common occurrence in that the upper class families didn't really care too much, or didn't know too much about the family, about the comings and goings of their workers, and there's definitely that sense of a real sharp division between the upper class and lower classes. I think it's not unlike what maybe some of you might be seeing in episodes of Downton Abbey. But I know in the British series Upstairs Downstairs about 4 decades ago, which is, you might say, one of the precursors to what Downton Abbey talks about, in Upstairs Downstairs, you could really tell who were the upper classes and who were the lower classes, even though they essentially shared the same living quarters, the same house. Okay, chapter 10. Chapter 10 goes into detail about Dao Jian, who's from the Guangdong or the I think the Canton province, and Ayana does a great job of giving you a sense of what's happening in China at the in the middle parts of the 19th century. Ayana talks about the breakdown of of the dynasties that is the strong the strong dynasty, the uh, Middle Kingdom notion that a lot of these Chinese dynasties had. I'm not much of an expert in terms of Asian cultures, but I would imagine that colleagues like Professor Bell and many of my other colleagues on in the history department, they can do a much better job of talking about what's happening in these respective Asian countries, these Asian kingdoms in the middle parts of the 19th century. But to make a long story short, where Dao Jian was growing up, it was a really harsh time. He was essentially orphan. He had many tragedies growing up, and and he was sold to a traveling caravan of merchants. But because Dao already had a sense of how to cure people, that helped him tremendously. So ultimately he ended up being the servant assistant to his master, who had to tell him as Zhong Yi. So by being the assistant to the Zhong Yi, Dao picks up a lot of important skills when it comes to medications, herbs, exercise, diet, things of this nature. So this serves him well. So all throughout the entirety of chapter 10, I think gives a great detail about how Dao really starts to come into his own and starts to mature, not only physically but mentally and spiritually as the chapter reaches its conclusion. Toward the end of the chapter, things go really bad for the Zhongyi and for Dao too. China had been devastated by the penetration of European colonialism, especially that of the British. China had been engaged in a series of what were known as the Opium Wars, as the British were intent on securing the full rights to the trade to trade of poppies, in which the seeds, of course, could be transmitted, could be transformed to could be transformed to the drug opium. Really nasty stuff back in those days. Uh, Probably comparable to something like heroin or something to that effect. But the point of it here is that because China's social political condition was so awful and so chaotic by the end of the 1830s, this made life miserable for the Zhongyi and for Dao. So ultimately, um, the Zhongyi's interests, his practices start to fall apart. Creditors are after him, and ultimately, at the end of the chapter, the Zhongyi passes away, and Dao is left on his own. So chapter 10 ends in essence where Dao is now orphan again. His mentor, his master, has passed away. Now Dao must make a decision as to what to do with his life, and that's something that's going to be picked up in chapter 11, which we'll talk about in the next video installment. Okay, now as I mentioned, all of these things are coincided with events going on in chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 7 and 8 in the Rawls and Bean text. So let me just quickly go over just a couple of key points, or just review some of the main elements. In chapter 7, entitled "The American Conquest," obviously this is what's happening during the U.S.-Mexico War, which broke out in the spring of 1846. Ended militarily in the fall of 1847 once American forces seized Mexico City and stormed the famous castle at Chapultepec. And then by the spring of 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. And then once the treaty was ratified by both the U.S. Senate in May of 1848 and the Mexican Congress later on in the May of 1848, the result of all of that was that by the middle part of 1848, California had now passed over into American hands. So it's while this maneuvering is going on militarily, diplomatically, politically. This, of course, is when James Marshall epic strike was announced in early 1848. People like Sam Brandon spread the news. Later on in the spring of 1848. But what's interesting about California is that the events in California took on some crazy twists and turns. In chapter 7, of course, you read about the infamous Bear Flag Revolt, in which these people, these wild and wacky guys known as the Bear Flaggers, heard all these crazy rumors that something was going to happen, that their rights were going to be taken away, blah blah blah, this and that. So they came upon Sonoma and in essence seized the fort, seized the main garrison there at Sonoma, and took many prominent Californios into custody, including Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. Interestingly, many prominent Californios in this time, they loved American ideals. They liked the idea of uh, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union. The ideas of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all of that fun stuff. A lot of prominent Californios really loved those ideals, and they saw the Americans as trading partners. Many of them already had contacts with merchants from New England, from Boston, from New Haven, Providence, New York, Philadelphia, those places. But what happened was a lot of the settlers who came into California who were living in John Sutter's property. These were people who you might say, I wouldn't call them, you might say, the bottom of the barrel, but let's put it this way: they weren't as erudite, they weren't as scholarly, they weren't as quote refined as many of the Americans that people like Vallejo, the De La Guerra family down towards Santa Barbara, the Bandinis in San Diego, the Carrillos of Los Angeles. The upper class Californios uh, dealt with a different kind of, American person, refined, erudite, scholarly, into the fine arts, fine wine, blah blah blah, that type of thing. But a lot of the settlers who came into California a little bit later on and lived in the places where John Sutter was, these were people who were rough. They were loud. They were obnoxious. They were this. They were. You get the idea. So when these guys came into Sonoma and arrested Vallejo, Vallejo was really disillusioned by what had happened. And to make matters worse, because people like John C. Fremont, the famed or infamous, depending on your point of view, Pathfinder. Fremont was a rabble rouser who pretty much did whatever he wanted. He was basically the one who was going on saying to the settlers, hey, watch out, those Mexicans, they're going to come and take your daughters, they're going to come and take your guns, and this and that. So Sutter was, you might say, stirred up a hornet's nest in Northern California, and Sutter went up north toward Oregon. He was nowhere near Sonoma when the Bear Flag Revolt happened, but when the Bear Flag Revolt hit, Sutter and Fremont, in essence, came back to some towards Sonoma and said, "Oh yes, I'm in charge here. I'm the leader of this outfit." Blah blah blah. But again, a lot of crazy stories about what Fremont was all about, and undoubtedly you came across some of this in chapter 7. Okay, and chapter 7 goes a little bit about some of the conflicts between the Californios, about how some of them were more pro-American and others were more pro-Mexican. So the split among the Californios is going to touch upon a little bit in the PowerPoint program. That's addressed a little bit in chapter 7 too. All right, chapter 8, here is where the gold rush begins the process of economic development in California. And you see some depictions of what people thought or how they could get to California. And you probably saw on page 103 this idea of of, you might say, an early blimp, an early dirigible, zeppelin, that type of thing. So obviously, the point of all this here is that the gold rush really caused a lot of crazy ideas and stirred the imagination of not just many Americans, but people all over the world. Much like the Spaniards who heard stories about El Dorado, or they believe that California was the place where there's Amazon Queen was there, and she had her Amazon warriors, and it was an island to the west of the Indies called California. That's where the term came from. It was a Spanish 16th century novel about knights and damsels and dragons and fair maidens and all of that fun stuff. Kind of like the stuff that you will see at the medieval times tournament and dinner place over out toward Disneyland. But you might say a lot of Americans and Europeans, you might say, had these wild and wacky ideas too. There's a great documentary that PBS did about 10 years ago about the gold rush. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to add it to the class, but I think for future sections, I'll add that too, because there's a lot of great historians who were interviewed, including the late J.S. Holliday, who I think is the most foremost and excellent scholar on California. He's the one I think who really uh, brought about or helped to usher in these new works, these new articles, new books, uh, outlining how California was indeed a place where the whole world rushed in the middle parts of the 19th century. Okay, so again, a lot more about economic development, some of the early mining techniques, stuff that again that touches upon during the story. It's echoed nicely here in chapter 8. The paths, of course, people were taking to get there. Of course, people had to wait until the spring of 1849 to finally make their way across the country, because of course you couldn't you couldn't travel in the winter. In fact, I think if you're in Boston right now, you can't travel in the winter. Period. No matter you have planes, highways, and railroads and subways. Uh, uh, but of course, back in these days, people didn't have that, so they had to wait until the spring. The vast majority of Americans wait till spring to cross the country, across the Great Plains. And of course, that's where the term the 49ers came in that they were traveling westward in 1849. Many of those who could travel they traveled around Cape Horn, like the people we're meeting in Daughter of Fortune. Others took a route across the Isthmus of Panama, where the present Panama Canal is located. They were doing this at the end of 1848, very beginning of 1849, but it was the spring of 1849 where the exodus, the movement westward, really started to get rolling. Okay, and the last important point I want to mention here about chapter 8 is the fact that, um, and this is something that Allende talks about too, in that some of the early miners that came to California, they were, you might say, more soldiers of fortune, in that they operated independently of any corporations, of any boss man. They could come in, and if they found a pretty good strike, especially the first arrivals who came into California in 1848. If you came to California in 1848, you had the best plot of land. You had the best stream. You didn't have to worry about fighting with anybody. So for many Mexicans who came in from Sonora, they were among them. They had the most advantageous position because, of course, traveling from Sonora through Southern California into the gold fields was relatively easy compared to trying to travel across the country. But in 1849, the equation changed, and that, of course, we had more conflict, more strife, more clashes between Anglo-Americans against the Mexicans, against the Chileans, against the Peruvians, against the Native Americans, against the Chinese, and the Australians. They weren't much better either. I think I touched upon a little bit about this in my first video, but I think it bears repeating at this point in time. But by the 1850s, by 1852, 1853, you now had more mining interests, more Eastern interests come on the scene, and basically these early joint stock companies. So in other words, within the span of about 4 short years, really fascinating. The early miners, these were more independent operators. They found a claim, and they didn't have to answer to anybody. But by 1853, now you had more Eastern concerns come in. Companies from Boston, from New York, Philadelphia, they were running the show. These were the guys who had a lot of the hydraulic operations that's mentioned in both Daughter Fortune and in the Rawls and Bean text. So within the span of 4 short years, mining changed from an individual pursuit to a corporation, to a IBM, Apple type of operation. So if you consider how fast that changes with the span of, it's really quite remarkable that that's exactly what happened in California. So that by the mid 1850s, uh, any attempt to get individual fame and glory with a gold rush had pretty much been eradicated. In fact, a lot of us are pretty much eradicated by 1853, as Rawls and Bean touch upon, especially in chapter 8. All right, I know this video ran a little bit longer than I expected, but that seems to be par for the course. So I think at this point in time, for the rest of the readings of Daughter Fortune, if you don't mind listening to me for about 20, 25, upwards of about a half hour. still, nonetheless, I think it's important for me to give you a sense about not just a recap of the readings, but a little bit about my perspective, my feelings, and my sentiments about the topic as we continue on with the Daughter of Fortune, and of course, do a quick recap of how the Rawls and Bean readings touch upon with what Ayanna talks about. All right, that's it from here, everybody. So that's it for part three. We'll pick this up again next week as we go on and see what happens in go on and see what happens in from chapter 11. I think it's chapters 11 through 13 in Daughter of Fortune, and we're going to see more about the relationship between Dow and Eliza, and we'll see what happens when Eliza finally reaches California. All right, that's it from the French Family Headquarters, everybody. I'll come back and see you guys again next week.